We are now at the decade of 1920, a decade that is sometimes described as the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age. This decade began with a passage of two amendments to the Constitution. So the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. And there are a couple ways to think about this. On the one hand, this was not that long ago. This means that women have been able to vote for only about the last 100 years, and for a majority of the history of the United States, women did not have the right to vote. On the other hand, this was 100 years ago, and in spite of the fact that women have had the right to vote for 100 years, there are still notable disparities between women and men. Now, of course, even when laws are passed to support equality, disparities continue to exist. Notably, at this point in history, black men had the legal right to vote for about 50 years, but aside from a few years of Reconstruction that occurred immediately after the Civil War, white people made it impossible for black men to exercise this right. At this point in history, essentially, black men could not vote. A black man attempting to exercise his rights could be in danger of being lynched. Also, most southern states required voters to pass literacy tests, or they had other requirements, and these were administered in a way so that all the white people passed and all the black people failed. And so black people and black men were thereby denied the right to vote. The other constitutional amendment at the beginning of this decade was the 18th Amendment, which prevented the transportation and sale of alcohol. This was the beginning of prohibition in the United States. Notably, prohibition was supported by the progressive movement and by women. It was, in part, an attempt to address the problem that alcoholic husbands were spending time and money at saloons, and these husbands sometimes abused or abandoned or failed to support their families. And at this point in history, people on average drank more alcohol than they do today. And so problems with alcohol use and dependence were very real problems, and these problems were probably even more pervasive then than they are now. So this law was attempting to address a very serious issue. However, the law had many loopholes. For one thing, it was set to take effect 1 year after ratification. So that meant wealthy people could buy large stockpiles of liquor during that year, so they would have plenty of liquor when prohibition went into effect. The picture on the lower right-hand side of the screen is a picture of a store selling liquor just before prohibition went into effect. Also, the law was written in a way to try to gain support from farmers, and farmers often kept their own hard cider that they would make and keep in a barrel, maybe on their porch. And so to gain support from farmers who made their own hard cider, the law allowed people to keep juice that just happened to ferment. Notably, during Prohibition, the California grape industry made a tremendous profit selling grapes. And these grapes came along with a warning label describing specific steps that should not be taken because it might cause the grapes to turn into wine. So overall, enforcement efforts were grossly underfunded. And given the number of people who wanted to drink, prohibition would have required a tremendous investment to enforce. Moreover, there were many areas that had no desire to enforce prohibition. And so this gave rise to organized crime. And the picture on the lower left-hand side of the screen shows a car riveted with bullet holes from a shooting. And this became more and more common throughout Prohibition. Bootleggers would make and sell liquor, or they would smuggle it in from other countries such as Canada. This is the era of speakeasies, and speakeasies were illegal nightclubs that sold liquor. These speakeasies were different from the saloons that existed prior to Prohibition. So prior to Prohibition, there were saloons, and these saloons were exclusively for men, whereas both men and women could go to a speakeasy. And although speakeasies were illegal, they paid bribes to law enforcement officials so they would be allowed to operate. And not only did Prohibition give rise to organized crime, but it also produced deadly forms of alcohol. For example, during Prohibition, alcohol was allowed for industrial purposes, but this industrial alcohol had to be denatured. This was done by adding a small amount of wood alcohol that made it poisonous to humans. But bootleggers sometimes tried to recondition this denatured alcohol, or they simply sold alcohol that was mixed with other unsafe liquids. And as a result, many people died from drinking poisonous alcohol during Prohibition. So the decade of 1920 included many changes for women. As we noted, women gained the right to vote, and women could join men at speakeasies. And many women who were embracing these new liberating trends and who were following a new fashion trend became known as flappers. I believe the term comes from the fact that part of the flapper fashion could include wearing galoshes or rubber boots that were unbuckled so that the top part of the boot would flap around. Part of the style was to have short hair and to appear relatively flat-chested. And flappers did things that were considered scandalous in more conservative areas of the country. They did things like they wore makeup, they wore skirts above the knees, they went to speakeasies, and they danced and they smoked and they drank in public. These were all things that were relatively scandalous in conservative areas. So the 1920s was a decade of the flappers. This is also the time when jazz music becomes popular. And jazz is a distinctively American style of music. It evolved primarily out of African American culture, and especially in the area of New Orleans. The pioneering jazz musicians were black men who became famous, often playing in nightclubs for white audiences. One of the famous jazz musicians was Louis Armstrong, and he's pictured here seated in the center with King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band in 1923. And it was in 1925 that the Scopes trial took place. This was the trial where a school teacher in Tennessee was accused of teaching evolution in a public school. Ever since Darwin proposed his theory of evolution, there were people who were opposed to the theory on religious grounds because one of the creation stories in the Christian Bible describes creation over a 7-day period. And this became a wedge issue that politicians could use to gain political power. And so in Tennessee, they made a law against the teaching of evolution in school. Now, John Scopes, he was a school teacher, and he intentionally claimed to have taught evolution. And he did this so that he would be charged, so that this would create a test case for the law. And by the way, as a further illustration of the popularity of eugenics at this time, it's notable that the textbook that he used, it was a book titled A Civic Biology. This book not only included a section on evolution, but it also had a section supporting eugenics. So anyway, this trial created a big, huge public spectacle. Crowds came to Dayton, Tennessee, where the trial was being held. They came from all over. There were souvenirs that were sold. There were actually even performing chimpanzees there. And newspapers from across the country covered the proceedings. In the end, Scopes was found guilty and he was ordered to pay a fine, although the fine was then later waived due to a technicality. And on the screen, you see a picture of John Scopes on the right, a picture of souvenirs being sold outside the trial at the bottom left, and a scene from inside the trial at the top left. Also, during the decade of 1920, there's continued growth of the Ku Klux Klan, and membership grew to about 4 million members. And the Ku Klux Klan was not limited to the South. It was popular in many parts of the Midwest and throughout the entire country. And their racism was not limited to black people, but it also included anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic attitudes. In 1925, they held a march in Washington, D.C., and pictures on the screen are pictures from this march of the Ku Klux Klan in Washington, D.C. And in 1921, there was a horrific massacre of black people in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is sometimes called the Tulsa Race Massacre. So there was a black neighborhood in Tulsa called the Greenwood neighborhood, and it had a thriving business district known as Black Wall Street. It had achieved a degree of prosperity with restaurants and hotels and theaters owned by black entrepreneurs. Many white people in Tulsa probably felt threatened by the seeming prosperity of the Greenwood neighborhood. So what happened is that on May 30th, 1921, in downtown Tulsa, there was a young white woman named Sarah Page who was an elevator operator. And something caused her to scream when a young black man named Dick Rowland attempted to enter her elevator. It's impossible to know what happened. Some speculate that maybe Rowland accidentally stepped on her foot, or maybe he tripped and grabbed her arm. But whatever happened, after Sarah screamed, Rowland ran away. But the next morning, he was arrested and put in jail. Then, later that day, a Tulsa newspaper printed an article accusing Rowland of assaulting Page. And so that evening, a few hundred white men showed up at the courthouse with plans to remove him from jail and to lynch him. But at that point also, a small group of armed black men from the Greenwood neighborhood showed up, and they wanted to protect Rowland. But then the mob of white people grew, and it got larger and larger. And then at some point, a gun went off, and that triggered the white mob on a violent rampage. The white mob descended upon the Greenwood neighborhood, and they began killing people and looting homes and businesses and burning buildings. Then the next morning, the white mob actually increased in size, and the riot continued. By the end of the day, best estimates are that maybe 300 black people were killed, and more than 1,000 homes and businesses were destroyed, and about 35 city blocks were turned into charred ruins. Thousands of people were left homeless, and the residents of the Greenwood area, they lived in tents over the winter as they attempted to rebuild. No one was ever charged for any of the atrocities. The government provided no financial assistance, and they even rejected offers of assistance from the outside. And it took steps to try to erase the event from history. People were buried in unmarked graves, and records were destroyed. On the screen, you see some pictures showing the devastation after the massacre, and also a picture of a tent that people lived in as they were trying to rebuild. And in 1924, the National Origins Act was passed. This was the first comprehensive immigration law in the United States. So in the decades prior to this law, a large portion of the immigrants to the United States were Jewish, and many came from eastern and southern parts of Europe, such as Italy and Hungary and Poland and parts of Russia. And the rationale for the law was based largely on work from the eugenics and the intelligence testing movements. That is, work suggesting that a Nordic race was superior and that this race was being extinguished in the United States by the recent immigrants from non-Nordic parts of Europe. The law involved first making an estimate of the national origins of the current United States population, and then the law required setting quotas for how many people could be admitted from each country based on the estimated percent of people with descendants from that country already living in the United States. Notably, black people whose ancestors were slaves were not counted. Also, for China and Japan and all other Asian countries, the quota was arbitrarily set at just 100 people per year. On the screen is a political cartoon from the time that was in support of the National Origins Act. This screen has a few examples that give us a feel for the effects of the National Origins Act. It compares immigration in 1921, which is a few years before the law went into effect, with immigration in 1924, right after the law went into effect. So as you can see, immediately after the law went into effect, people immigrating from Russia decreased by 96%, and people immigrating from Italy decreased by 99%. In other words, the effect of this law was substantial. And notably, this figure would look even more dramatic if we compared immigration rates with rates just prior to World War I, because in part due to a preliminary restriction law that was already passed in 1921, and in part due to a reduction in immigration that occurred during the war, European immigration in 1921 was 69% lower than it was in 1914. So if we used 1914 as our comparison date, the results would look even more dramatic. Also note that the immigration cuts for the Asian countries were even more drastic than the cuts made to European countries. As I just mentioned, a quota of just 100 people per year was set for China and Japan and other Asian countries. So in sum, this law drastically cut immigration to the United States. Here is a figure displaying immigration rates to the United States since the early 1800s. The top figure shows immigration in absolute numbers, and the bottom figure is probably more informative because it shows immigration as a percent of the total population. And what this shows is that the decade of the 1920s represented a dramatic change in the United States in terms of immigration policy. So prior to this decade, here we have the total percent of the population that were immigrants was substantially higher, and since that time, the total percent of the population that's immigrants is much, much lower. Relative to the decades prior to this law, current immigration into the United States is quite low. In fact, at the time that I'm recording this, they are incredibly low. Now let's pick up on our story of Ronald Fisher in England. Recall that Fisher was that statistician who was easily annoyed and maybe difficult to understand. He had a master's degree but no academic job, and Fisher was angry with Carl Pearson, who published Fisher's paper as if it were only a footnote to a larger study. Now, although Pearson published Fisher's paper as only a footnote, Pearson apparently saw potential in Fisher, and so Pearson offered Fisher a job to come and work as his assistant. This meant that Fisher finally had an offer for an academic job. However, Fisher was still angry with Pearson, and he couldn't let his anger go. So he turned Pearson's offer down, and instead he took a job with a fertilizer company. Specifically, he went to work for the Rothamsted Agricultural Experimental Station. It was a British fertilizer company that had collected years of data regarding different fertilizers they had developed, and they needed someone to figure out what to do with all their data. On the screen is a picture of the Rothamsted Agricultural Experimental Station. I think it's their main building in the front, and then behind that you see all the plots of land that they use to test their different fertilizers. So in the 1920s, based on his work at that fertilizer company, Fisher publishes a series of papers titled Studies on Crop Variation, and also a book titled Statistical Methods for Research Workers. Later, in 1935, Fisher will publish a book called The Design of Experiments, and that book will summarize his earlier ideas, and that book will become highly influential in psychology research. So, what were Fisher's ideas? Well, one of the key things he did is to define what an experimental design should look like. And he stressed the importance of random assignment. As we've seen, prior to this time, people studying medical treatments often failed to use an experimental design to test the effectiveness of their treatments. And part of the reason for this is that the importance of an experimental design simply had not yet been established. So Fisher clearly defined what an experimental design should include, and he specified that it required random assignment. People, or corn plants, or whatever being studied, cases need to be randomly assigned into treatment groups to have a valid experimental design. And Fisher also developed formulas for calculating something called analysis of variance, or ANOVA. And Fisher's ANOVA is similar to Gossett's t-distribution. So like the t-distribution, an ANOVA can be used to estimate the amount of sampling error in a study based on the number of people, or corn plants, or whatever the cases are, but it can estimate the amount of sampling error based on the number of cases that are included in a study. The difference is that Fisher's ANOVA is much more flexible than Gossett's t-distribution. ANOVA can be used in a much broader range of different types of research studies. Also, Fisher made a distinction between two terms that he called, one was called a statistic and the other was a parameter. He differentiated between these two different terms. And he defined a statistic as a numerical value that applies to a sample, and a parameter is a numerical value that applies to a population. And these would be very important terms for the future development of statistics and data analysis. And Fisher creates formulas for something called p-values. And p-values are another tool for addressing the issue of sampling error. Specifically, if a researcher conducts a study and discovers some kind of effect, it would be good if the researcher were to consider the following question. Consider this: what is the probability that my study could have produced this effect if in truth, if in the entire population there is actually no effect whatsoever? What's the probability that I would get the result that I just got if in truth in the population there's no effect at all? What's the probability of that? And p-values allow researchers to answer this question. So in sum, Fisher's developing mathematical tools that researchers can use to critically analyze the results of their research and to determine how much trust should be placed in those results. As we've seen, previous research prior to this point was plagued with problems of researchers being overconfident in their findings. Fisher provided tools to address this issue, and anyone who has taken an introductory psychology statistics course should recognize all the concepts I've just been talking about, because Fisher's work comprises a substantial portion of the foundation for data analysis today. Now let's pick up on the story of Ivan Pavlov's work. Here is a picture of Pavlov and one of his dogs, and I presume a research assistant. Recall that in 1909, Yerkes published a paper that introduced psychologists in the United States to Pavlov. And then John Watson gave a speech on Pavlov when Watson was elected to be president of the APA in 1915. So Pavlov's work becomes the foundation for American behaviorism. Now, if we think about it, it might not have been entirely predictable that behaviorism would latch on to Pavlov. First of all, Pavlov was not American. He was not even from a country that was influential in shaping psychology. Also, as I will clarify in just a moment, Pavlov did not entirely adhere to behaviorist ideals. So it might be that when John Watson proposed his behaviorism, he was mostly proposing an ideal for how research should be done, but at that point it lacked a large body of existing research to support it. It seems kind of like the behaviorists stumbled upon Pavlov's work and realized it was an established body of work that could fit within the behaviorist model, so they grabbed it and used it. Notably, Pavlov conducted his studies in highly controlled conditions. Eventually, he built a building called his Tower of Silence, which is depicted on the screen. This building included walls that were insulated with 2 feet of turf. This made it possible to put animals in testing rooms where they would not hear any extraneous noises. So, what was the basic model of Pavlov's classical conditioning? Well, the basic model is that you start off with an unconditional stimulus. And an unconditional stimulus is something that naturally elicits a physiological response. For example, food will naturally make an animal salivate. Food will elicit a salivation response. So then, the unconditional stimulus is repeatedly paired with a conditional stimulus. For example, a conditional stimulus might be a metronome or a buzzer or some kind of touch on the animal. Notably, Pavlov is often described as using a bell as the conditional stimulus, but he probably never actually used a bell. So, with repeated pairings, when the unconditional stimulus is repeatedly paired with the conditional stimulus, eventually the conditional stimulus by itself will elicit the same response as the unconditional stimulus. For example, maybe the ticking metronome starts to elicit salivation. Today, this response is typically called the conditioned response. But this is actually somewhat of a mistranslation of Pavlov. A more accurate translation would be to call it the conditional reflex. So Pavlov would have called it something like the conditional reflex. So Pavlov made many expansions on his theory, and some of the key expansions include the concepts of extinction and generalization and discrimination. So extinction occurs, for example, if a ticking metronome is repeatedly paired with food so that it elicits a conditional reflex, and then it is stopped being paired with food, and so eventually its effect will be extinguished and it will stop eliciting the conditional reflex, and that's extinction. Or generalization would occur, for example, if a ticking metronome is repeatedly paired with food so that it elicits a conditional reflex, and then maybe a metronome ticking at a different tempo might elicit the same conditional reflex. In other words, the effect generalizes to other stimuli, and that would be generalization. However, if a metronome ticking at one tempo is repeatedly paired with food, and a metronome ticking at a different tempo is never paired with food, then the dog will learn to discriminate between the two tempos. In this case, the conditional reflex will only occur in response to the metronome ticking at the correct speed, and that would be called discrimination. Here are a few more pictures of Pavlov, and it's interesting to consider some of Pavlov's ideas that do not really fit with a behaviorist model. First, Pavlov believed that the effects of conditioning were produced because stimuli cause excitation or inhibition responses in the cortex of the brain. In other words, his theory pertained to hypothetical processes occurring in the brain that could not be observed. And that doesn't really fit with a behaviorist model. Pavlov also believed that his dogs had personalities. He actually published work in which he classified his dogs into specific personality categories. And again, behaviorism does not typically investigate personality. Also, Pavlov explored the topic of experimental neuroses in his dogs. He looked at ways that his dogs might experience a kind of psychological distress. And he actually observed 3 different types of situations that he thought would produce this type of doggy neuroses. For example, one situation was that if he was doing a discrimination study where a dog had to discriminate between 2 stimuli, where one stimuli was paired with food and the other wasn't. And if the 2 stimuli were so similar that the dog couldn't discriminate, maybe one was a circle, one was an ellipse, they were so similar the dog couldn't tell them apart, and that produced doggy neuroses, that the dog started becoming restless, this dog started biting things and barking, and the dog became upset by that situation. Also, in 1924, there was a flood, and the laboratory flooded, and the dogs were trapped in cages with rising water. And afterwards, Pavlov observed that the dogs behaved erratically, and they were especially upset by any sound of water. So that was another situation that seemed to produce this doggy neuroses. And then finally, he observed that if he paired food with electric shock, that also made the dogs very upset. It produced doggy neuroses. Here is another picture of Pavlov operating on a dog. And notably, Pavlov was in Russia doing his research during World War I and during the Russian Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And Pavlov, I suppose, had somewhat of a mixed relationship with the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks liquidated St. Petersburg Bank, and they took all the money from Pavlov's Nobel Prize. But eventually the Bolsheviks saw Pavlov's work as valuable, and they wanted to support him. At one point, the Bolsheviks offered Pavlov extra rations during a famine, but Pavlov refused to accept unless his co-workers and animals were also fed. In 1923, Pavlov requested to leave Russia, but he was denied permission. Yet he was allowed to visit the United States on 2 occasions. Actually, his second visit, he gave a lecture that was attended by B.F. Skinner, and Skinner was very much inspired by Pavlov's lecture. Eventually, Pavlov became more tolerant of the Bolshevik government, possibly due to the rising German threat that began to occur a bit later on here. Notably, Pavlov was reported to have a temper. He's someone who often got very angry with his assistants. One story is that during the Bolshevik Revolution, there was an assistant who was 10 minutes late to work due to shooting that was going on in the streets. And reportedly, Pavlov told that assistant, well, quote, "What the hell difference does a revolution make when you've work to do in the laboratory? Next time there's a revolution, get up earlier." So Pavlov reportedly had a temper and often said harsh things to his assistants. Another story is after castigating an assistant in public, Pavlov told that assistant, "Okay, let's make a deal. You let me shout, don't pay attention, and do your work." So also, as I mentioned, Pavlov lived in Russia, and in Russia at this time, Jewish people were the primary group that was persecuted and oppressed. Russia was highly anti-Semitic, and in line with his culture, so was Pavlov. For example, once he told an American scientist who spent years working in his lab, he told this person that Jews occupy, quote, "high positions everywhere." And Pavlov said that it was, quote, "a shame that Russians cannot be rulers of their own land." So Pavlov was highly anti-Semitic. And what about John Watson? Where we left him last, he had proposed his new behaviorism, and he had conducted that somewhat problematic study with little Albert. Well, for Watson, the decade of 1920 will be the decade in which a sex scandal ends his academic career. So, John Watson and his wife Mary were friends with the Reiners, and the Reiners were another prominent family in the area. And the Reiners had a daughter named Rosalie, and eventually Rosalie became John Watson's student and research assistant. In fact, I believe the young woman who was assisting Watson in the pictures I showed you of the little Albert study is Rosalie Reiner. Notably, it appears that John Watson had a long history of having affairs throughout his entire married life. And also recall that Watson's wife, Mary, was originally a student in one of his classes. So Watson had a history of affairs and a history of inappropriate interactions with students. And Watson begins to have an affair with his student, Rosalie. Now, Watson's wife, Mary, was aware of this affair, and she wanted to find a way to stop it. And a possible opportunity came when the Watsons were invited to dinner at the Reiners' house. That is, they were invited to have dinner with Rosalie's parents at a time when Rosalie would not be there. So they went to the dinner, and while they were there, Mary Watson said she was not feeling very well, and so she went to rest in Rosalie's bedroom. Then, when she was alone in Rosalie's bedroom, Mary searched the room and found a pile of love letters that John Watson had written to Rosalie. And so she took the letters, and her intent was to use them to try to stop the affair. However, Mary also showed the letters to her brother, and her brother wanted to use the letters to blackmail both John Watson and the Reiners. Well, this turned into a great big mess, and eventually it led to a scandalous public divorce, with many details being published in the local papers. And this led to Watson being fired from his job at Johns Hopkins University, and after that he was unable to find any other academic jobs. On the screen is a picture of John Watson and Rosalie Reiner. So after his scandalous divorce from Mary, John Watson and Rosalie Reiner get married. And Watson goes into the advertising business. And eventually he makes quite a bit of money in advertising. He also continued to publish on psychological topics. However, because he was no longer in academics, because he no longer worked for a university, he no longer had to submit his work to peer review. And with this constraint removed, his ideas become more and more radical. He could say essentially whatever he wanted to say. So in 1924, he publishes a paper that has in it what I would call his famous "Give me a dozen healthy infants" quote. And in this paper, he makes a grandiose claim that environment determines everything. So what did he say? So in this paper, he said, quote, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggarman, thief, regardless of the talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." So his behaviorism focused on how people are shaped by the environment, and eventually his views became so extreme that environment could determine everything. Also, his views on the effects of nature and nurture, and specifically his views on the importance of instincts, changed over time. Because initially his psychology included instincts, but eventually all instincts were eliminated from his behaviorism. Environment determined everything. And in 1928, John Watson and Rosalie Reiner publish a book together that's targeted for the general public on the topic of child care. It was called Psychological Care of Infant and Child. The title page for the book is depicted on the screen, and I noticed that instead of simply listing Rosalie as a co-author, it places the words, quote, "with the assistance of" before Rosalie's name. Instead of describing her as a co-author, it describes her as someone who merely assisted with the book. I suspect this may be a product of the sexism at this time in history. However, receiving full credit for authorship of this particular book would not have necessarily been a good thing, because the book actually gave horrible advice to parents. The title refers to psychological care of infants and children, but a more accurate title might have been psychological harm of infants and children. The book advocated for what they called a, quote, scientific, behaviorist type of parenting. But their approach was cold and emotionally detached, and they advised parents not to show affection to their children. For example, one chapter in their book was a chapter titled Too Much Motherly Love. And in this chapter, they advise parents this. They say, when you are tempted to pet your child, remember that mother love is a dangerous instrument, an instrument which may inflict a never-healing wound, a wound which may make infancy unhappy, adolescence a nightmare, an instrument which may wreck your adult son or daughter's vocational future and their chances for marital happiness. Or at another point, they talk about the importance of treating your children as young adults. And they say this, they say, let your behavior always be objective and kindly firm. Never hug or kiss them. Never let them sit on your lap. If you must, kiss them on the forehead when they say goodnight. Shake hands with them in the morning. Give them a pat on the head if they make an extraordinarily good job of a difficult task. So that was their book, Psychological Care of Infant and Child. Now, with the type of advice that Watson gave to parents in his book, it might make you wonder, how did Watson's own children turn out? And unfortunately, the answer is what you might have suspected. His own children experienced many life difficulties. He had 2 sons with Rosalie, and they both had poor outcomes. One entered psychoanalysis for help, and the other was an alcoholic who later committed suicide as an adult. Watson also had 1 son and 1 daughter from his first marriage with Mary, and the daughter appears to have been an alcoholic who attempted suicide several times, and her daughter, the person who would have been Watson's granddaughter, became an actress that wrote a book about her life in which she described her own family as extremely dysfunctional. So, after publishing his book on childcare, Watson did little else that was directly related to psychology. But he did become quite wealthy from his career in advertising. Sadly, Rosalie died at a relatively young age. Rosalie died in 1935, about 7 years after the childcare book was published. She died from an illness that she caught when they went on a trip to the West Indies. And on the screen is a picture of John Watson later in his life.
The captain pleaded night and day, still the cursed ship was turned away. Now children beg in a marketplace, they sing a dirge, and who will weep for grace?
Now let's pick up with the story of clinical psychology. Recall that at this point, clinical psychology is closely associated with the intelligence testing movement. Clinical psychologists are people that primarily conduct assessments, and the most common type of assessment they do is to administer an intelligence test. And during the decade of 1920, clinical psychology continues to be focused on assessment and intelligence testing, but there are some new areas opening up where they can do this testing. And one of these areas involves the development of something called child guidance clinics. These were nonprofit organizations often promoted by people who were part of the progressive movement. Specifically, people associated with the progressive movement were concerned by the fact that many large cities had areas of high poverty, sections of town that were highly impoverished and often comprised largely of recent European immigrants. And one of the concerns about these areas is that they were terrible places to raise children. So the main idea was that child guidance clinics would provide services and interventions for troubled children, and especially for children growing up in these impoverished areas. Sometimes they were set up as a treatment for juvenile delinquents, with the idea it could provide an alternative to prosecuting children in the criminal justice system. And this movement was influenced by a belief that emotional disorders begin in childhood. And so if we intervene with children, we can help the children to grow up to become healthy adults. And the primary goal was to help children with intellectual or conduct problems. And the very first child guidance clinic was established by a psychiatrist, that is, a medical doctor, named William Healy. He established the first clinic in 1909, actually, in Chicago. So, as a psychiatrist, Healy's theory was primarily based on Freud. So the theoretical focus was psychodynamic. And when I use the word psychodynamic, I use the term psychodynamic to refer to theories that are based on Freud, and also to theories from Freud's followers that later split from Freud and proposed their own ideas. So psychodynamic theories, in one way or another, go back to Freud. In general, psychodynamic theories are ones that emphasize the role of subconscious drives, and these theories emphasize the role of childhood experience in shaping adult behavior. Now, part of Healy's model was that he thought it was important to find ways to let each child tell his or her own story. And, especially important for our current history, in regards to psychology, Healy valued the use of assessment instruments, and he was interested in Stanley Hall's work on adolescence. So, although his model was primarily based on Freud, Healy also had interest in potential integration between the child guidance movement and psychology. So this provided a way to another opening for psychologists at this time in history. And the child guidance clinic movement began to grow throughout the decade of 1920. And by the year 1927, there were 102 clinics across the nation. And the staff for a typical child guidance clinic typically included one psychiatrist, that is a medical doctor, and the psychiatrist would have been the director, the person in charge of the clinic. And a typical clinic included one psychologist, and the psychologist would have been someone who conducted assessments and who attended case conference meetings and provided consultation based on the assessment results. And then the clinic would include a team of social workers who carried out all the actual work with the children. So a clinical psychologist was typically only one person at the child guidance clinic. However, this is an example of how clinical psychologists are beginning to find professional roles to fill. The picture on the right-hand side of the screen shows a psychologist administering a test at a child guidance clinic. Another new development that provided professional options for psychologists is that many universities were opening up university counseling centers. And university counseling centers were often entirely run by psychologists. They were inspired by work from the intelligence testing movement, and psychologists used testing to provide vocational guidance. In addition, many other tests were developed, such as the first version of the Strong Vocational Interest Inventory, which is a test designed to help people determine which career is the best match for them. And part of the goal of these counseling centers was to help students overcome any obstacles they might encounter so they could maximally benefit from college education. This might include addressing issues such as personality, or addressing learning difficulties, or addressing financial problems, or addressing health problems. Note that at this time in history, the terms counseling, vocational guidance, and student personnel all meant the same thing. So you might go to the University Counseling Center, or it might be called the University Vocational Guidance Center, or it might be called the University Student Personnel Center. It all meant the same thing. So working at a university counseling center doing vocational guidance is another new professional option for psychologists at this time. And in addition to these new professional options for psychologists, overall, psychology is becoming more and more popular within the general public. During this decade, a brand new magazine is published titled Psychology, Health, Happiness, Success. This shows that there is a growing public interest in psychology, and people tend to associate it with secrets and tricks people can use for self-improvement. As the title of the magazine implies, people can use psychology for health, happiness, and success. And it is also during the decade of 1920 that psychologists begin to use Rorschach cards. These are the ink blots that a psychologist would show to a client and ask, "What might this be?" The ink blot on the screen is one that I made myself. This probably added to the mystique and mystery surrounding the new psychology. A psychologist could determine a person's intelligence, and a psychologist could determine a person's personality by the way the person responds to an ink blot. Now, notably, one new development in the decade of 1920 that did not involve psychologists was the rise of psychoanalytic clinics. So Freud's ideas were becoming very popular in the United States, and people could go to a psychoanalytic clinic to receive psychoanalysis. This would be the classic approach that involves laying on a couch and doing free association and talking about your dreams. Or people could also receive other related forms of psychodynamic therapy. That is, they could receive one of the treatments proposed by one of Freud's many followers who later developed their own ideas that were based on Freud's ideas. Notably, these treatments were usually provided by psychiatrists, that is, medical doctors, and they were almost never provided by psychologists. So that's one area that was not open to psychologists at this time.
Now children beg in a marketplace. They sing a dirge, and who will weep for grace? And who will weep for grace? And who will weep for grace?
And now I want to introduce to you Carl Rogers. So during the decade of 1920, Carl Rogers was still in graduate school, but eventually he will go on to play an important role in the future of clinical psychology. As we've seen, clinical psychology during the 1920s was focused mostly on assessment, and it did not involve doing psychotherapy. At this point, the only types of psychotherapy are psychodynamic types of therapy provided by medical doctors. Eventually, though, clinical psychology will expand to include doing psychotherapy. And Carl Rogers can be regarded as the very first person who is specifically a clinical psychologist, that is, a psychologist and not a medical doctor, the very first clinical psychologist to propose a prominent theory of psychotherapy. And he is also probably the first psychologist to do research on psychotherapy. And Carl Rogers is also yet another very interesting person. And like the story of John Watson, his story will eventually include some flawed research, some interpersonal difficulties, and some unethical behavior that was harmful to other people. As we're going to see, he proposed a theoretical model that promoted the unconditional acceptance of people, but his real-life behavior suggested that he may have had some insecurities or desires for power that sometimes made him rather insensitive. So anyway, Carl Rogers was born in 1902. So he would have been 12 years old in 1914 during World War I. And he grew up in Chicago in a very large family. He had 2 older brothers, 1 older sister, and 2 younger brothers. The picture on the screen shows Carl on the right with several other family members. Carl's father owned a construction company that became quite successful. In fact, later on in the 1980s, the company would eventually be taken over by Carl's brothers. And at that time, the company income averaged $100 million annually. Also, his family was strongly religious, and they had very conservative values. His family had family prayers every morning, and they attended a congregational church. And his parents did not approve of dancing or drinking or going to movies. These are things that were commonly opposed by people with conservative religious values at this point in history. So when Carl was in high school, his family moved to live on a farm. This was the type of farm that a prosperous family might purchase because they like the idea of living on a farm and not something the family really needed for generating income. The farm was on a large plot of land, and the family had several employees to help run it. On the screen is a picture of the family's house on the farm, and as you can see, it looks like a very nice house. Now, part of the reason for moving to the farm is that Carl's parents were concerned that living in the city might have a corrupting effect on their children. And Carl's parents often limited the extent to which Carl was allowed to socialize. And by moving to the farm, they placed further limits on Carl's ability to interact with other peers. In addition, his parents valued hard work, and Carl was expected to complete many chores. He was expected to get up early in the morning and to come home directly after school. When Carl had free time, he mostly spent it by himself, exploring nature on the family farm. Outside the family, he did not have many friends. Although notably at school, he was an excellent student. His grades were often straight A's, so he did well at school. So after completing high school, in 1919, Carl Rogers enrolled at University of Wisconsin in Madison to begin his undergraduate studies. At first, he intended to major in agriculture to become a farmer. But he started getting involved in religious groups, and he became more and more interested in religion. And this launched him on what might seem like somewhat of a roller coaster religious journey. So, Carl decides he wants to become a minister, and he switches his major to history with the hope that this will prepare him to enter seminary to receive training as a minister. Also, at this time, there is a Christian youth conference scheduled to be held in China, and the conference is called the World Student Christian Federation Conference. And Carl is selected to be one of only a small number of youth delegates from the United States to attend the conference. The picture on the screen is a picture taken at this conference in China, and as indicated by the arrow, Carl is in the back row. And Carl's participation in this trip is indicative of the religious zeal that he had at this time in his life. And notably, the trip also exposed him to different ideas and different cultures. For example, when Carl took the ship across the ocean to get to the conference, Carl had long conversations with a sailor who had challenging questions about religion. So Carl's religious viewpoints start becoming more liberal and more contemplative, and he becomes interested in difficult theological questions that are hard to answer. This was apparently concerning to his parents. In letters from his parents that were written around this time, they express concern about his liberal theological ideas and not enthusiasm for his desire to become a minister. So after graduation, Carl married a woman named Helen. She was a girl he had known as a child, and probably the only person he dated in college. And the picture on the screen is from their honeymoon. And in line with his plans to become a minister, Carl enrolled at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Notably, this is the same seminary that Stanley Hall attended several decades earlier. And he chose this particular school because it was relatively liberal, and for this reason his parents did not approve. Although they had plenty of money, they gave Carl very little financial support for school because he had chosen to attend the wrong type of university. And then what happened is, while Carl was at seminary, he developed further questions about religion. And he began to question religion more and more. And then he began to question the value of religion altogether. So after 2 years, Carl graduates from seminary, but then after that point, he had no further involvement in religion at all. He abandoned organized religion entirely. In fact, his children recall that they grew up in a home where God was never mentioned. So, what did Carl Rogers do? Having completed seminary, but with no further interest in religion, what did he do? Well, it turns out that the seminary was right next to Columbia University, and there was occasional interchange of faculty and students between the seminary and the university. So, in 1926, Carl Rogers essentially crossed the street and enrolled at Columbia University and began graduate work in psychology. Specifically, he enrolled in a program described as a clinical and educational psychology program at Columbia University. Now, Rogers' work there might be described as satisfactory, but probably not impressive. Notably, he did take a class with Thorndike. Recall that Thorndike was a member of that first cohort of psychologists in the United States. He was the one I described as being a strongly eugenic psychologist doing research on learning, intelligence, and cats in puzzle boxes. However, Carl reports that he found Thorndike rather boring and dull. And otherwise, Carl did not study with anyone particularly famous. He did not appear to have established a strong mentor relationship with anyone. It took him 3 years to complete his dissertation after he left the program, and he did not receive any academic job offers after graduation. My guess is that if the faculty were to have nominated a student as most likely to succeed, they definitely would not have nominated Carl. Now, one thing that Carl gained from his graduate experience is an appreciation for the value of objective measurement and assessment. So many of his professors were involved in clinical psychology, and as we've seen, clinical psychology at this time focused primarily on assessment. So accordingly, much of Carl's coursework would have focused on assessment. And also, another important experience that Carl Rogers gained while he was a graduate student is that he got a paid internship at a child guidance center. Now, this was before clinical programs required students to complete practicum work, so this was not something directly connected with his graduate work. It was probably more like getting a part-time job to help to pay for graduate school. Now, as was typical for psychologists at child guidance clinics, Carl administered assessments. He administered intelligence tests and other tests. For example, he administered something called the Healy Picture Completion Test and a form board test where children placed geometric shapes into cutouts on a board. And he administered a maze test, and he administered various achievement tests. And also, as with all child guidance clinics at this time, the clinic was run by a psychiatrist, and the main theoretical model would have been Freudian. So at this point, Carl Rogers would have been exposed to Freudian theory. So now at the end of this decade, at the end of the 1920s, at this point, Carl Rogers would have completed all of his coursework, but he had not yet completed his dissertation. However, he did have a job. Now, it was not an academic job at a university, but it was a job. But the story of that job will have to wait for the next decade.